My name is Gage LaPierre, and today we're over here at Prairie Creek Preserve. Prairie Creek Preserve is it's a pretty cool place. It's just 10 minutes southeast of Gainesville, Florida. If you ever get a chance to come walk around out here, you should definitely do it. It's a lot of fun, a lot of stuff out here. And right now, we're walking through what's known as a bottomland forest. And so, what is a bottomland forest, and how do I know that I'm in this right now? Well, like always, let's just think about what's below our feet and how what's below our feet is influencing what we see above ground. So, unlike some of the other communities we've talked about in the past, both bottomland forest and alluvial forest can occur across a wide variety of different soil orders, which is different than some of these other communities, which are um, pretty much only occur across certain soil orders. Often common, though, to see a wide variety of different mixtures of sand, alluvial sediments that are deposited in both floodplain forest and alluvial forest. Typically, this is much more so in alluvial forest, where flooding is more frequent than bottomland forest. And so, with that in mind, let's just talk about flooding and how it influences bottomland forest. So, a bottomland forest, like this one here at Prairie Creek, does undergo flooding throughout the year. Typically, this is less than what would occur in an alluvial forest, but nonetheless, just this one flooding event, which right now, as we're walking through Prairie Creek right now, and this is in the month of September, year 2020, we just had some tropical storm developments come through. And so some of the overstory species that we're seeing in this bottomland forest here at Prairie Creek include some species that we've talked about before, like laurel oak, live oak, which is Quercus virginiana, red maple, which, as you remember, is typically a more weedy species that responds to open gaps in the forest. This also includes species like sweet gum, which here at Prairie Creek are, in some places, are very large. And even on the edges, we also see some species like tupelo and bald cypress. And this typically occurs in these areas that start to transition into alluvial forest. Another species that we're also seeing in certain areas here at Prairie Creek is swamp chestnut. And so, depending on where you are in the state, you might see a different arrangement of these species in a bottomland forest. And so, again, the overstory and bottomland forests are typically composed very heavily of deciduous hardwoods, although there are at times the presence of loblolly pine and some other conifers like spruce pine, but this is not as common. And so, one of the things that can happen in the understory in bottomland forest and really characterizes it is typically pretty open. Depending on where you are in the state, you can see just a very different set of species in the panhandle. The species in some of the bottomland forests are very different than the ones you're going to see here in North Florida and Central Florida. In the case here at Prairie Creek, some of the species that we're seeing a lot of this chasmanthium, which is pretty common in this Gainesville area. And here at Prairie Creek, it just dominates the understory. Hey there, everyone. So we're over here today at Gum Root Park, which is just outside of town of Gainesville, Florida. It's like 10 minutes away, southeast of town. And this is another pretty unique place. And today we're over here looking at a bottomland forest. And right now we've had a lot of rainfall in Gainesville from recent storm events, and you can just see how much this affects this bottomland forest here. It's also very important to mention that in the case of bottomland forest, as well as alluvial forest, the hydro period, or rather the time span in which these areas and these communities are flooded, is very critical to the composition in these communities. And so with that in mind, it's also important to mention that fire is very infrequent in bottomland forest and alluvial forest. Hey there, everyone. Today we're over here at Oleno State Park. Oleno State Park, as you've seen in some of our other videos, is just an awesome place. A lot of upland pine, and it sits right along Santa Fe River. And to date, we're actually walking through what is known as an alluvial forest. And so it's very similar to a bottomland forest, but the chief difference between the two is the hydro period, in which alluvial forests tend to have longer flooding periods than bottomland forest. So this difference in hydro period between alluvial forest and bottomland forest communities leads to a slight difference in community composition between those. Okay, and so some of the species that we're seeing today here at Oleno State Park include one very good example of overcup oak. This is a very large specimen here that we're seeing today, and just shows you how large this species can get. We're actually at the southern extent, I believe, of this species range. Other species that we're seeing include water hickory, more laurel oak, as we've seen in some of our other sites, and we're also seeing one species that we have seen in other communities, even in some mixed hardwood communities. And this species is American elm. Haven't really talked too much about it. Finally, we're also seeing some river birch, and as the name implies, river birch often occurs along these streams and rivers, and it has this very characteristic flaky bark. So there's a lot of human activities that threaten bottomland and alluvial forest across the state of Florida. The main threats, as with a lot of communities, is just the clearing of these areas for human activities, things like agriculture and namely silviculture in certain areas. In the past, dam construction and changes in hydrology upstream of rivers has also affected bottomland forest and alluvial forest greatly by altering the hydro period in which these communities are adjusted to. It's important to keep in mind that in the past, bottomland forest, as well as other forests across the state of Florida and other communities, were utilized for timber extraction, and so the composition of what we see today in some areas may not be exactly how they looked even just 100 years ago.